Turn to Romans 9, where we pick up Paul's argument. He has, from the very beginning of Romans, argued that salvation is not of works, it's not about the law, that it never could be because all humans are completely lost. We are incapable of keeping the law. We're incapable of pleasing God, that this is something that He had to do for us, and that we received this gift of salvation completely and only by faith, by putting our faith in Jesus Christ. And then he further argues that this is because God has provided for us in His own will from before eternity, that He foreknew us, that He predestined us, that He called us, He justified us, He glorified us in Jesus Christ. But now He has faced a challenge, a difficult issue, and that is, okay, if indeed this is all of God, if God's the one who willed this and gave us the gift of faith, how do you explain that so many of Israel, so many of Paul's kinsmen according to the flesh, as he calls them, the Jews, have not received their Messiah? Has the word of God failed? I mean, God gave this promise to Abraham. God gave this promise through the prophets. Does this mean the word of God has failed? And He's got to deal with that issue. And the way He resolves it is simply by telling us that that what has happened because it is God's plan. There's no plan B with God. God wasn't waiting to see whether or not Israel would receive Him, and so they didn't, and then He went to the Gentiles. No, God's will was always to include the Gentiles, and it was always only through God's sovereign will that even a remnant of Israel could be saved. And he keeps looking at he's pointing us to these Old Testament passages to show us that this has always been who God has declared Himself to be. This has always been true. It's not like this was not revealed in the Old Testament and suddenly we're shocked and surprised to find in the New that, God is the one who's been doing this all along. No, he says this is precisely what God has been doing. We know this because, remember, Abraham pleaded with God, that Ishmael might live before you. God said, no, he's not the son of promise. You're going to have another son, Isaac. He's the son of promise. And He told Rebekah that in her would be 2 children, twins, and that the older would serve the younger. And Paul makes the case that he said this before they ever did anything. Yet he said, Jacob have I loved, Esau have I hated. Now, picking up the argument there in verse 14, and we're going to cover a lot of territory this morning, so listen quickly, okay? He says, what shall we say then? Is there injustice on God's part? By no means. For He says to Moses, I will have mercy on whom I will have mercy, and I will have compassion on whom I will have compassion. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God, who has mercy. For the Scripture says to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I raised you up, that I might show my power in you, and that my name might be proclaimed in all the earth. So He has mercy on whomever He wills, and He hardens whomever He wills. Now you will say to me then, well, why does He still find fault? Who can resist His will? Who are you, old man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to the molder, why have you made me like this? Has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use? What if God, desiring to show His wrath and to make known His power, has endured with much patience the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, in order to make known the riches of His glory for vessels of mercy, which He has prepared beforehand for glory, even us, whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but also from the Gentiles. As indeed he says in Hosea, those who were not my people, I will call my people. And her who was not beloved, I'll call beloved. And in the very place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they will be called sons of the living God. And Isaiah cries out concerning Israel, though the number of the sons of Israel be as the sand of the sea, only a remnant of them will be saved. For the Lord will carry out his sentence upon the earth fully and without delay. And as Isaiah predicted, if the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and become like Gomorrah. What shall we say then? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they did not pursue it by faith, but as it were based on works. They've stumbled over the stumbling stone. As it is written, behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, and whoever believes in him will not be put to shame. Tomorrow, it's on my schedule, I'm going to give an interview to an Associated Press religion reporter who wants to talk to me about artificial intelligence. You may have heard about this recently. I don't know if any of you have gone on that chatbot site, and I've done it. I got on there and I talked to him about Plato's allegory of the cave, and I even put in there, I said, how would Hershael York preach Romans 9? And it told me. He was right. I say I don't know what it is. But here's the thing, universities, seminaries, everybody's sort of scrambling right now. I've made the point before that the law always has to catch up to the offense. Like, certainly people start doing stuff, we go, we know that's not right, but there's no rule, no law against it. Well, that's happening now because students immediately started going on there and having this artificial intelligence write their papers. Now look, it's against the rules to steal someone else's thoughts, right? But there was no rule against artificial intelligence. And so now universities, even seminaries are having to say, okay, we got a rule now, you can't do that. But you know where else it's going now? Preachers. So this is what the reporter wants to talk to me about. There are preachers who are allowing artificial intelligence to write their sermons. And this reporter wants my opinion on it. And after listening to sermons for my whole life, I want to say, for some of them, it will be an improvement. But, here's the truth. When I preach, I want it to be not just because I've studied, not just because I know Greek, not because I'm a seminary professor. I want it to be out of the overflow of a love relationship with Jesus Christ. I think that's what you need. I think you don't need just some intellectual spiel. And by the way, if you talk to the chatbot about any particular controversial subject, it will always end the discussion by saying, but there's another view and all that. It mitigates it. I know a lot of preachers who actually do that. I want you to see that Paul he takes us in some ways maybe where we don't want to go. He forces us to see what the scripture is saying in ways that make us uncomfortable. He's showing us how God has dealt with humanity. Now, I want to point out, when we're talking about artificial intelligence, we can't help but think about sentience. That is self-awareness. I would argue that God only created two races that have sentience, true sentience, a self-awareness, a conception of both past, present, future, an awareness of others, because first of all, only humans are created in the image of God, but there's another sentient race out there, isn't there? Angels. And yet, God did not deal with the angels the way he dealt with us. Both certain angels and humanity fell. And God acted in grace only toward one race. You are already more privileged than any angel. Because God has loved you in spite of your sin and through your sin. God has loved humanity so much that he provided a way for fallen, sinful, rebellious, proud creatures who want to rule in his place to be saved nonetheless. He did not do that for Lucifer. He did not do that for the angels. And so when Paul here is showing us God's sovereignty, that God has intervened in humanity, he has ensured that heaven will resound with his praises from some of his creatures whom he has redeemed in spite of their sinfulness. Here's the question, all right, how do we respond to this knowledge of God's sovereignty? Because we talked last week about, let's face it, there are tensions in the scripture. It clearly talks to us about our responsibility and repentance and faith. We're not robots and we're not fatalists. But at the same time, we know God's completely in control. How do we balance these things? How do we respond to the knowledge of God's sovereignty? Well, let me just give you three, I think, pieces of advice from this text Paul's given us. The first thing is just go ahead and admit it. Let's acknowledge God's bigness. I like that theological word, God's bigness. My goal is always to preach a big God. And consequently, my goal is always to preach really teeny tiny little human beings. If our preaching can exalt God as high as we can get him, then our preaching should also debase humanity about as low as we can get them apart from the grace of God. Now, God's grace does something else in us. God's grace elevates us. God doesn't leave us there. But let's just admit that God is big and great and awesome and sovereign in a way that we are not. And Paul's reminding us that this is and always has been God's testimony of himself. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, this is what the scripture says about God. He says here in verse 14, is there injustice on God's part? Now, God forbid, God is never unjust. Do not confuse fairness and justice. I can't say it enough. God is not obligated to be fair. Fairness is not an attribute of God. God does not treat everybody equally. And the only way he could treat all humans equally would be to condemn us to hell. He treats all angels equally. If you sin, you're reserved in chains of darkness for everlasting punishment. And if you don't, you get to remain in heaven singing holy, holy, holy. But there's complete fairness among the angels. There's no extension of grace. There's no extension of mercy. There's nothing but fairness. But to humans, he's always just. He's never unjust. Look, his absolute justice, no injustice with God. Fairness is not a divine attribute. He says, by no means. For God says to Moses, I will have mercy upon whom I will have mercy. The whole point is that with God's absolute justice, he shows to some his undeserved mercy. If you could deserve it, it wouldn't be mercy. The whole point of mercy is you don't deserve it. God shows it. It's undeserved. And he says, I will have compassion upon whom I will have compassion. His gracious compassion. He sees us bound in our sin, completely broken in our lostness, incapable of ever keeping the law or achieving salvation, incapable of ever pleasing him in ourselves. And yet he shows this gracious compassion. And then he says, okay, you will say to me then. Well, let me back up in verse 16. So then it depends not on human will or exertion, but on God. Here he speaks of God's glorious power. I wasn't saved because I tried harder than someone. My salvation doesn't come because of my exertion. It's not of man, nor the will of a man. It's because of God's unilateral power. It depends completely on him. And he says, for this very purpose I have raised, he said to Pharaoh, for this very purpose I've raised you up, that I might show my power in you. Now look, why when God sent Moses to stand before Pharaoh and say, let my people go, God told Moses what Pharaoh was going to say. And he told Moses what he was going to do the entire time Pharaoh said no. And God's plan always was to get to that 10th plague, because it's in the 10th plague that Christ was going to be revealed in the Passover. So you find both things in the book of Exodus. It will say Pharaoh hardened his heart, and that's completely true. And it also says in the book of Exodus, God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Both things are there. And God had a purpose, even in Pharaoh's rebellion, even in Pharaoh's refusal. Why? To show his power. This is exactly what Paul's arguing. God has the right to do as it's not that he was making Pharaoh do something he didn't want to do. This was who Pharaoh was to begin with. God just simply hardened in him in who he already was, because God had a purpose to display his power in him. God's glorious power displayed even in the rebellion of a man like Pharaoh. But then Paul knows the way our minds work. Okay, so then he has mercy on whomever he wills, and he hardens whomever he wills. Okay, Paul, how can God find fault with anybody if everybody is simply acting in accordance with what he has willed and determined? Now that's the answer I want. Isn't that the answer you want? And here's Paul's answer. Who are you to ask that question? Now, Paul, that just doesn't satisfy me at all. And this is Paul telling us you're not going to be intellectually satisfied with this answer. What you want, the same way when you ask God, when you are in pain and you're hurting and you ask him, why are you allowing this in my life? What is it you want? You want God to explain that to you so it makes perfect sense. And then knowing why, it sort of takes your pain away. God doesn't do that, does he? He says, I'm God, you're not. You just have to trust me even in your pain. And here you have exactly the same move on Paul's part. You say, well, how can God find fault? If he's really in charge and everybody's acting in accordance with his pre-mundane plan, how can he find fault with anybody? And I want Paul to answer. I want to say, okay, let me explain this to you. It's going to make perfect sense when I'm done. And he just goes, who are you to ask the question? And you know what? That's as much answer as I'm going to get this side of heaven. And the truth is, I don't know how much I'll ever understand on that side of heaven. I know this. The glory and the goodness of God is going to be so apparent in heaven that we're going to trust him with everything. We'll look back on pain and sorrow, and it won't be painful and sorrowful to us anymore, because it will be so caught up in his glory and his goodness. And we will realize that we're there in heaven not because of anything we did, but simply because he showed mercy on us. He showed compassion. And I'm not saying we'll ever understand everything. We're not going to be God. And throughout eternity, I'm convinced we'll still learn, we'll still grow. There will be things that we will acquire knowledge throughout eternity. I'm looking forward to conversations with Newton and Paul and David and Peter. I want to talk to a lot of people in heaven. I'm not going to know it all. I'm still going to grow throughout eternity, but I'm not convinced that I'll ever know the whys, why God saved me, for instance. I'm not sure I'll ever know why he did that. And Paul here simply says God has an unqualified right. And we may not understand it. It may not intellectually satisfy us. But we have to come to the place where we see God's glory and his bigness so great that we say, yes, Lord, you do have the unqualified right to show mercy on whomever you will, and I do not have the right to question you about to whom you show mercy and to whom you do not. Now, I would just say, if we don't like a God in control of everything, look back over those attributes we've just named that are here in the text. Can I just ask you which one of those you would be willing to give up in the God you serve? Would it comfort you to serve a God that's not a God of absolute justice? Or a God who shows undeserved mercy? Well, to whom would he show it? Or a God who has gracious compassion? Or a God who has glorious power that he is completely within his rights to display at any moment in history he chooses, because he's the author of history? Would I be willing to deny God his unqualified right to save whom he will? Do I really want to put that power completely on humanity and say, okay, boys, it's up to you? I don't think we're willing to give up any of those attributes of God. We need to acknowledge God's bigness. Whatever else you think about Romans 9, you've got to get that. That's what Paul's saying is, this is no puny God we serve. We serve a God who's in control and in whom we can have complete trust. And this is why in verses 19 through 29, you summarize it, it's simply this: you need to accept God's purpose. You will say to me then, why does he still find fault? Who can resist his will? But who are you, O man, to answer back to God? Will what is molded say to its molder, why'd you make me like this? Now, I just want to point something out to you. That Paul pushes this teaching about God's sovereignty so far that it raises an objection. He's got to deal with the objection, well, how can God find fault with anybody if everybody's just doing what he's determined? And he has to deal with that. Now, I want to point out to you that if my preaching doesn't make you ask that same question, then I'm clearly not preaching the same thing Paul is preaching. I would suggest to you that there are an awful lot of churches and preachers out there whose preaching never raises this question. And I can only conclude one thing: they're not preaching what Paul is preaching. Because if you really show the bigness of God, people are scratching their heads going, hey, wait a minute. And he has to deal with that. And once you understand that, okay, Paul really is pushing this thing so far that we have to ask that question. Now, his answer doesn't intellectually satisfy us. His answer doesn't wrap it up in a nice box with a bow on it that we can open and go, oh, now I get it. Now it makes perfect sense. But here is what he's clearly saying: God's creatures have no right to question it. He doesn't resolve the answer. He just simply says, who are you? I mean, that's really the issue he's answering in this passage, is who's God? Well, God's big. God's in control. God's in authority. God has a purpose to show his power for his glory. Who are you? Who are you? You don't have a right to question God. God has the right to make his creation fit his purpose. And this is what he says here, is that he has the potter no right over the clay to make out of the same lump, one vessel for honorable use and another for dishonorable use. Is it not within the potter's right, if he wants to take this one lump of clay, and out of this one lump of clay, he makes one pot, a beautiful vase that's going to sit on the shelf, and the mom's going to say, "You kids, don't you dare touch that. That's beautiful. We're going to always care for that, and you're never allowed to play with it." And out of the same lump of clay to make what we used to call a chamber pot. He has the right to do that. The pot doesn't get to go, "Hey, I don't like this. Why did you make me like this?" Shall the thing formed say to him that formed it, "Why hast thou made me thus?" See, what you must understand, if you say you don't like this, is that God's people have no hope without it. Apart from this, we have no hope. He says if God has the purpose of making known his power, and it's just true that in history that there are going to be some who are destroyed because of their sin, and others who are in heaven because of God's grace. He has the complete right to do that. You got to understand, your option here, your alternative is not that God saves everybody, or because if God just simply left it up to us in our clouded, sinful minds, no one would be saved. People have no hope without this. When Adam and Eve sinned, I want you to think about, I don't mean this in the sense of God was in trouble, but let me use the word predicament. Let's think about God's predicament. He has created the human race in Adam and Eve. And Adam and Eve were the only two human beings who ever had a true, clear mind. They had no sin clouding their mind. And yet, even in their state of innocence, they choose to rebel against God, to violate the one command he gave them. And when they did that, of course, then they fell. The race fell. Now their minds are clouded by sin. Now the curse is passed upon them. Now death has entered the world, and they're fallen. They're not just sick, they're completely dead in trespasses and sins. Now God has this predicament, that the race he created in rebellion against him now has fallen and is deserving of hell. And if he does nothing, if he leaves them to themselves, no matter what offer he makes, they're not going to obey him. They're not going to follow him. They're not going to trust him. How do we know that? The flood? What does it say? By the time of Noah, it says, the thoughts of man's heart was only evil continually, and it made God regret that he had made man. That's where they went. And so God, faced with this, none are righteous, no, not one. None seek after God. Only their thoughts are evil continually. So what does God do? When the flood comes, he could have let them all drown, and he would have been absolutely just in doing so. But what did he do? He spared 8. And then out of all the people in the world, when the world be repopulated, he could have let them all die. But instead, he goes to one guy named Abram in Ur of the Chaldees. And he chooses him, and he speaks to him. And out of the grandchildren of Abram, he chooses one named Jacob. And out of the sons of Jacob, he chooses one named Judah. And out of Judah, on down through Judah's line, he comes to a family of a man named Jesse. And out of all Jesse's sons, he chooses one named David. And Through David's line, all down through the centuries, you come to the time of what we call the New Testament, and he chooses one descendant named Jesus, who's not like the others. He's God in the flesh. Don't you see, if God had not intervened, if God had not guaranteed every one of those things in Noah, in Abram, in Jacob, in Judah, in David, and ultimately in Jesus, we'd all be lost. His purpose was always to, Paul says it here, to make known the riches of his glory for the vessels of mercy that he has prepared beforehand for glory. Now he goes back to his question. His question here is about Israel and the Gentiles. And he said, now, God's plan was always to include the Gentiles. How do we know? The book of Hosea. And here in verse 24, he quotes from Hosea, even us whom he has called, not from the Jews only, but from the Gentiles, as indeed he says in Hosea. Now, the book of Hosea is a backwards love story. Hosea marries a woman that he knows when he marries her, she's unfaithful. And yet he marries her anyway. They have a child, and that child he names Jezreel. But then she has two other children that are not Hosea's. And God tells him to name them, the first one, Lo Ami, which means not mine, not my people. And then she has that third child, his second illegitimate one, and he says, call that one Lo Ruhamah, unloved. Boy, can you imagine being a kid going through life? I mean, forgive me here, but this is, I want you to get in Hebrew the full significance of it. It's like asking a kid, what's your name? He shows up first day of school, what's your name? He says, my name is Bastard. What a name to hang on a little child, but that's the name that this child had, not mine. But the day comes, Hosea finds his wife who had left him, gone out into sin. He goes down to the slave market, and there she is, the wife of his youth. Now she's used up. The effects of a hard life all over her. And he buys her. And he says, but you're going home with me not as my slave, but as my wife. And he changes the names of those children from Lo Ami, not mine, Ami, mine, my people. Ruhamah, beloved. This is what God did for us. We're not, maybe somebody here is descended from Abraham, not many of us. I guarantee you, I'm not descended from Abraham according to the flesh. But God looked upon us who had no claim to be a descendant of Abraham. We didn't have the law and the prophets. Jesus didn't come from among us. And yet he looked at us and he said, you're mine. You're loved. You're loved. You're not illegitimate. You're mine. I've chosen you. I've adopted you. See, if none are righteous, if none seek God, and he's argued that completely through the book, that means then God must seek them. If they can't be righteous, then he must supply their righteousness. It really is as simple as that. If they're not his people, then he has to do something to make them his people. See, God's promise would not be kept apart from his intervention in our lives. You see, he says here in verse 27, that's as true of Israel as it is of the Gentiles. This is the part that Paul says his kinsmen didn't get. That they were counting on the fact that they were descendants of Abraham and that they had the law, that alone would save them. But I just want to point out to you, if the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John prove anything, it's that the best Jews of Jesus' day rejected him. I mean, the doctors of the law oppose him. They're claiming righteousness that they don't have. And after explaining the salvation of the Gentiles, now Paul turns to Israel, and he said this is exactly what Isaiah said about the Jews, that even within the descendants of Abraham, there would still only be a remnant. And that only because God worked in their hearts. Or what? Isaiah says, you know what? If the Lord of hosts had not left us offspring, we would have been like Sodom and Gomorrah. He says that Isaiah's argument always was that there would only be a remnant, even within Israel. And isn't that what we see? In the day of Elijah, Elijah's up there in the wilderness crying out to God, I'm the only one left. God says, no, you're not the only one left. There are 7,000 who've not yet bowed the knee to Baal. You know what I'm going to say? That's great. That's better than one, but that's still not many. Out of the whole nation of Israel, only 7,000. That's a remnant. And when the Israelites are taken captive and they go to Babylon and then into Persia in captivity, and Cyrus, the Persian king, says, okay, you can go back to the land. How many come back? Do they all go, wow, we get to go back to our homeland, back to Jerusalem. We get to worship in the temple again. No, very, very, very few do it. Man, we like Persia. There are shopping malls here. There's running water here. Why go back to that God-forsaken place where we're going to have to rebuild everything? And there's only a trickle, only a remnant. There's only been a remnant ever. This is what he says, that we just have to understand that God has been working his purpose, and if he weren't doing that, we'd all be lost. There'd be no hope. But the greatest response to God's sovereignty is to attain God's righteousness. So after Paul makes this argument, look, God had to sovereignly intervene in both Jews and Gentiles. Nobody would be saved if God hadn't been working in hearts, working in history to make this happen. Look at verse 30. What shall we say then? Okay, what am I getting to? What's the point here? That Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness, they weren't following the law, they weren't going to the temple, they weren't offering the sacrifices, they who did not pursue righteousness have attained it. That is, a righteousness that is by faith. But that Israel, who pursued a law that would lead to righteousness, did not succeed in reaching that law. Why? Because they didn't pursue it by faith. You get what he's saying? Jew and Gentile alike have to receive salvation by faith. Now here's what I also want you to see. Yes, it's God working. He's working above things, behind things, through things, around things. God's doing his work, but it is never like we have no idea about Jesus. We have no idea about the gospel, and yet somehow we got chosen. No, it's always that God operates through the gospel. It's through the gospel that he quickens hearts. It's through the gospel that he gives us evidence of his sovereign work in our lives. And that's by faith. We have to believe. Jew and Gentile alike have to believe God's sovereignty in no way changes the means that God uses to save us. God saves us only one way. How does Romans begin? Romans 1:16. I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, because it is the power of God unto salvation to everyone who believes. The Jew first, also to the Gentile. There is no salvation apart from faith in Jesus Christ. This is why we preach the gospel. This is why we plead with people to put your faith and trust in Him. And I want you to know, I absolutely believe in the sovereignty of God. I do not question. I don't know how you read the Bible and get around it, but I'm going to tell you what, I absolutely believe in spending and being spent and going to the last ounce of our energy, the last dime of our bank accounts, whatever it takes to get the gospel to the world. That's what we must do. The great Charles Spurgeon, he put it so well. He said, if sinners be damned, at least let them leap to hell over our bodies. And if they perish, let them perish with our arms wrapped around their knees, imploring them to stay. If hell must be filled, let it be filled in the teeth of our exertions. Let not one go unwarned and unprayed for. And that is the spirit of the gospel. How can we who believe in God's grace and have received God's grace ever be indifferent to people dying and going to hell? How could we? That's what gospel grace looks like. When we know the grace of God, we will go to any length to share it. We will plead with everyone around us to put their trust in Jesus. And Paul sums it up. Speaking again of Israel, he says, they've stumbled over the stumbling stone. Now we read 1 Peter. 1 Peter picked up all these Old Testament passages about Jesus being the cornerstone, a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense. And Paul quotes this same verse. He said, behold, I'm laying in Zion a stone of stumbling, a rock of offense. Now look, you are either standing on the rock or you are crushed under it. He is either the foundation of your salvation or He is the crushing justice on your sin. Jesus is either the giver of salvation or the obstacle to it. Because you cannot be saved any other way. And if you're trying to achieve salvation some way other than Jesus, He stands between you and your objective. You cannot have it any other way. Either you fall on the rock or the rock falls on you. And Paul looks at his kinsmen and he said, they've stumbled at the stumbling stone, the rock of offense. But it does not have to be that way. God's promise is that if you believe in Him, I love this, you won't be put to shame. Whoever believes in Him will not be put to shame. Where does shame come from? Well, shame comes from guilt. When you know you're guilty, you're ashamed. We all have so much to be ashamed of. But you know, Jesus died to take away your guilt. If you receive the forgiveness of sins in Jesus, you won't be put to shame. Shame comes from being unprepared. Remember Jesus told the parable of the 10 virgins? Pastor Chris preached that recently. And what happens when 5 of them are not prepared? They run out of oil. They're ashamed. How terrible it would be to die and to face the judgment because you assumed you had more time. And you'll be ashamed because you're unprepared. Shame comes from being shocked. Maybe you're going through life and you're thinking, I just don't believe this stuff. This is just too fantastic. that somebody who died 2,000 years ago could actually die in my place and pay for my sin. And I just don't believe it. Well, how shameful it will be to stand before the Lord when he returns, shocked, surprised that he did what he said he would, and he actually returned to judge the living and the dead. Now, Jesus warned us. Jesus told us in Luke 17, he said, as the lightning flashes and lights up the sky from one side to the other, so will the Son of Man be in his day. Just as it was in the days of Noah, so will it be in the days of the Son of Man. They were eating and drinking and marrying and being given in marriage until the day when Noah entered the ark, and the flood came and destroyed them. In the same way, just as it was in the days of Lot, they were eating and drinking, buying and selling, planting and building. But on the day when Lot went out from Sodom, fire and sulfur rained from heaven and destroyed them all. So will it be on the day when the Son of Man is revealed. On that day, let the one who's on the housetop with his goods in the house not come down to take them away. Likewise, let the one who's in the field not turn back. Remember Lot's wife. Whoever seeks to preserve his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life will keep it. I tell you, in that night there will be two in bed. One will be taken and the other left. There will be two women grinding together. One will be taken and the other left. Jesus said he's coming back. And if you're shocked that he keeps his word, you're going to be ashamed before the rock of offense, the stone of stumbling. But if you realize that God has been working in your life to bring you here this very morning to this very moment, so that you hear the free offer of God's grace, that if you will turn to him in repentance and faith, if you'll put your trust in him and receive him as Lord, you don't need to be ashamed. He'll deal with your shame. He'll forgive you. He'll give you eternal life. And you can know 100% certainly that Jesus died for you. All you need to do is receive it, because the gospel is the power of God unto salvation for everyone who believes. If you will believe, you may. You don't have to be ashamed. Security comes from simply taking God at his word. Take him at his word. Whosoever will, may.